My name is Daisy, and I'm 30 years old. I thought my life was perfect when I married Brad 2 years ago, after dating him for 5 years. We lived with his parents in their large house, planning to buy our own place once we had children. But 2 years have passed, and still no baby. My dream of starting a family hasn't come true, and the plans to buy our own home have been quietly shelved. As time went by, the space between Brad and me seemed to grow wider, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. He seemed more distant, and I told myself it was just the stress of work. I was living in a house full of people, but I started feeling more alone than ever. Maybe it was because Brad didn't seem like the man I fell in love with anymore. Despite this, I tried to focus on the positives. Brad's mother was kind enough, and although we didn't have the typical mother-in-law conflicts, her distance sometimes made me feel like an outsider. Brad's younger brother, Reagan, was much more approachable. He and I often teamed up to care for their father, who had been sick for years. Reagan worked from home, as did I, so we shared a lot of time together, managing the household while Brad was away. Caring for their father had been part of the unspoken deal when I moved in with Brad. "It's just temporary," Brad would say, promising we'd soon have our own life, our own home. But as the months dragged on, I wondered if that day would ever come. Reagan was always helpful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was becoming less of a wife and more of a caretaker in the eyes of Brad and his family. Things took a turn for the worse when I was in a car accident. I broke my leg, leaving me bedridden in the hospital for weeks. At first, Brad and his mother were attentive, visiting me every day. They brought flowers and comforted me, saying I'd be back on my feet soon. But as the days turned into weeks, their visits became less frequent. Eventually, Brad would only show up once a week, and his mother's cheerful attitude slowly turned cold. I tried to convince myself they were busy or stressed, but the nagging feeling of being abandoned wouldn't go away. Reagan, however, was the one constant. He visited me daily, bringing snacks, helping me with small tasks, and even wheeling me outside for fresh air when the hospital walls felt too suffocating. His kindness was the only light during a very dark time. One night, as I lay in my hospital bed, I overheard a conversation that shattered everything I believed about my life. I had been drifting off to sleep when I heard Brad's voice, low and frustrated. "She's completely useless now," he whispered to his mother. "If she can't even walk, what good is she? And kids, forget about it." My heart raced as his mother replied coldly, "You need to get rid of her before it's too late. She's just going to be a burden." I froze, pretending to sleep while my entire world crumbled around me. Brad and his mother were planning to discard me like an old piece of furniture, and I was powerless to stop them. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything I had done for this family, all the sacrifices, meant nothing to them. I was just a burden now. The days that followed were filled with unbearable silence. Brad barely visited, and when he did, his words were clipped and his eyes avoided mine. His mother, once so polite, now openly made snide comments. "If only you had given us a grandchild, maybe Brad would have stuck around," she muttered one afternoon, as if my inability to have children was my fault. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of their rejection. But Reagan was different. He continued to visit, bringing with him a quiet kindness that I desperately clung to. One day, as he wheeled me out into the hospital garden, I finally broke down. "Why are they doing this to me?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. Reagan didn't hesitate. "They don't deserve you, Daisy," he said softly. "You've done more for this family than they'll ever appreciate. You deserve so much better." Brad's attitude became even more callous when I started to show signs of recovery. The doctors were optimistic that I'd regain full mobility with time and physical therapy, but Brad wasn't interested in hearing that. "We should have gotten rid of you sooner," he snapped during one of his rare visits. His mother nodded in agreement, as if I was some sort of inconvenience they couldn't wait to be rid of. But Reagan wasn't having it. One evening, after another cold remark from Brad, Reagan finally stood up to his brother. "You don't get to treat her like this," he said, his voice firm. "Daisy has done everything for this family. You can't just throw her away." Brad looked taken aback, but Reagan didn't stop there. "If you don't want to be with her, fine, but you're not going to walk away without giving her what she's owed." That night, Brad filed for divorce. He didn't even bother to talk to me about it first. The papers arrived at the hospital the next day, and when I confronted him, all he said was, "You can have the house, just sign the papers." It was like he was offering me a consolation prize, a way to wash his hands of me without any further hassle. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Part of me wanted to fight, but another part of me was so exhausted from the months of neglect and emotional abuse that I just wanted it to be over. Reagan helped me move out of the house, packing my belongings and driving me to a small apartment I'd rented nearby. Brad and his mother didn't even bother to say goodbye. They were done with me, just as they had planned. After the divorce, I struggled to find my footing. I was no longer the wife, the caregiver, the person who had dedicated herself to Brad's family. But Reagan stayed by my side. He helped me set up my new life, supporting me in ways I never expected. His kindness wasn't out of obligation, it was genuine. We started spending more time together, and slowly, something began to shift between us. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, but over time, I realized I had feelings for him. Reagan was nothing like his brother. Where Brad had been dismissive, Reagan was attentive. Where Brad had been cold, Reagan was warm. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, truly seen, and it was Reagan who saw me. Just when I thought I had finally escaped the shadows of my old life, Brad returned. One evening, while Reagan and I were having dinner, there was a loud knock at the door. I opened it to find Brad standing there, looking disheveled and angry. "I'm moving back in," he announced, as if he still had the right to be in my life. I stared at him in shock, unable to comprehend his audacity. "I spent all my savings," he continued, pushing past me into the house. "I'll stay in the guest room. Mom's coming too." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brad had walked out of my life without a second thought, and now he expected to waltz back in like nothing had happened? Reagan stepped in, his face hard. "You need to leave, Brad. You don't live here anymore." But Brad wasn't listening. He raided the fridge, helping himself to our dinner like he still had a claim on the house. "This is my home too," he said smugly. "I don't care what you say." That's when Reagan dropped the bombshell. "Actually, it's not your home anymore," he said calmly. "Dad left this house to Daisy in his will. You and your mom have no claim here." Brad froze, his expression shifting from arrogance to disbelief. "That's not possible," he stammered. "This house was always ours." Reagan didn't back down. "Dad made the arrangements before he passed. Daisy owns the house now. You have no right to be here." For a moment, Brad seemed at a loss, but then his shock gave way to rage. Brad lashed out, knocking over chairs, smashing dishes, and shouting incoherently. His mother arrived shortly after, and together they started tearing through the house, destroying everything in their path. They smashed furniture, ripped curtains, and threw anything they could get their hands on. I stood frozen in disbelief, watching as the man I had once loved turned into a complete stranger. Reagan called the police, but before they arrived, Brad and his mother had already caused an unbelievable amount of damage. When the police finally showed up, Brad was still shouting about how the house was his and that he had every right to be there. "This is my home," he yelled as the officers restrained him. But Reagan was calm. "This house was never yours," he said quietly. Brad and his mother were taken away for trespassing and vandalism, and I pressed charges. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of court appearances, paperwork, and emotional exhaustion. Brad's pleas for forgiveness fell on deaf ears. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. Reagan stood by me through it all, never wavering. With Brad and his mother out of our lives, we finally had peace. But the house, which had once been a symbol of everything I had lost, became something more. It became the place where Reagan and I built our new life.